Welcome back to Behind the Genius, the place where we explore the darkest chapters of forgotten history. Today, we travel to Kansas, the year 1878, to a small farming town swallowed by dust and silence. Here, hidden behind rows of apple trees, stood the Bleakmore family farm, a place that looked ordinary from the road, but carried a secret so terrifying it was nearly erased from every local record. It was called the Cannibal Orchard, and at its heart was the Bleakmore family. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories like these, make sure to subscribe. Every time you hit that button, it motivates me to keep digging deeper and bringing you more terrifying history. The year was 1878, and the Kansas plains stretched wide and endless, golden under the summer sun and silver in the winter frost. It was a land that promised prosperity to settlers, but just as easily devoured those unprepared for its cruelty. Amidst these rolling fields sat the Bleakmore homestead, an isolated farm known to travelers not for its welcome, but for the unease it stirred in those who passed it. The house itself was a Gothic wooden structure, stark against the flat horizon, its slanted roof leaning as though under the weight of secrets. Beside it stretched an orchard, row upon row, of apple trees planted in unnaturally straight lines, too perfect, too symmetrical, as if they had been measured not with love, but with calculation. At first glance, the orchard looked like any other. In the autumn, its branches bent heavy with fruit. The apples were large, crimson as spilled blood, their skins glossy in the sunlight. But despite their beauty, no one in the nearby town of Caldwell ever bought them or ate them. Rumors spread quickly in towns like Caldwell. Farmers whispered that the apples carried a strange taste, sweet at first, then bitter, clinging to the tongue like rot. Others swore they caused dreams, visions of pale hands clawing from beneath the trees, or the cries of infants carried on the wind. Some even claimed that livestock who grazed near the orchard turned sickly within days, their flesh loosening, their eyes dulling until they had to be put down. Yet the Bleakmores themselves were untouched. The family of 5, Jonas Bleakmore, his wife Miriam, and their 3 grown children, Elias, Ruth, and Caleb, thrived in their isolation. They rarely came to town, and when they did, it was only to trade cured meats wrapped in burlap or barrels of dried fruit, never apples. They spoke little, avoided questions, and always returned to the orchard before dusk, as though afraid of being caught outside when the sun fell. It was not just their silence that unsettled people. There was something about their appearance, too. All were pale, their eyes a shade too light, their cheekbones too sharp. Some townsfolk swore the family smelled faintly of iron and smoke, as if the scent clung to them no matter how far they traveled. One autumn evening, a cattle driver named Henry Gales stopped at the Bleakmore farm when his wagon wheel broke near their property. Though they offered him water and a fire, Henry left within the hour, pale and trembling. He rode into town that night, drunk and babbling, insisting that when he sat near the orchard, he heard whispers coming from the roots themselves. Not the wind, he swore, not the wind, children's voices, crying, laughing, begging. He claimed that Jonas himself looked at him then, quiet as ever, and smiled in a way that made Henry's blood freeze. From that day forward, Henry avoided the farm like the plague. But others, curious or foolish, ventured closer. A pair of boys dared each other to steal apples from the orchard, and though they returned laughing, weeks later one of them fell ill and died. The other boy refused to speak of what they saw that day. He simply told his mother, "The trees were watching us." By 1878, the Bleakmore orchard had become a silent landmark of dread. Parents warned their children to stay clear of its rows. Travelers skirted wide around it, even if it meant adding hours to their journey. But the unease grew darker when people began to disappear. At first, it was drifters, those with no kin, no ties, men who wouldn't be missed. Then a woman traveling with her child. Then 2 farmhands who had gone out to hunt. Search parties scoured the prairie, but the land gave no answers. The missing seemed to vanish into thin air. The only constant, whispered in the saloons and churchyards, was this: every one of them had last been seen near the Bleakmore orchard. But here was the strange thing. The orchard itself seemed untouched. The trees grew stronger every season, their roots running deep, their fruit glossier, sweeter smelling. In fact, some claimed the trees themselves seemed to lean inward, toward the farmhouse, as if bowing to something at their core. It was during this time that a traveling preacher, named Reverend Amos Wilkes, came through Caldwell. Hearing the rumors, he declared the Bleakmore farm cursed, perhaps even a nest of devilry. The devil works in the soil, he told the gathered townsfolk, his voice carrying through the clapboard church. And where fruit grows too sweet, there is always blood in the ground. Though few dared challenge the Bleakmores openly, whispers began to spread faster than wildfire. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Men avoided the farm even in daylight. But one question lingered, heavier than the rest. If the Bleakmore family never sold their apples, and if they rarely traded in town, what exactly sustained them? When questioned, Jonas would only smile faintly and say, "The orchard provides." Miriam would lower her eyes. The children would not speak at all. And so the townsfolk stopped asking, though the silence festered like a wound. Then came the night of the first discovery. A storm rolled over Caldwell, black clouds ripping open the sky with thunder. The rain was relentless, tearing gullies in the earth, flooding shallow graves. At dawn, when the storm had passed, a farmer named Samuel Crowther found something half buried at the edge of his field. It was not debris nor animal carcass. It was the twisted remains of a child's skull, tiny and pale, washed clean by the storm. The sheriff dismissed it at first as the grave of a long-dead settler. But when more bones appeared in the following weeks, some small, some adult-sized, all of them weathered yet recent, the truth could no longer be denied. Someone had been burying bodies in the soil. Too many to ignore, and though no one dared speak it aloud, all eyes turned toward the orchard. For as the bones surfaced across the prairie, the Bleakmore apples grew richer than ever, redder than blood, and the whispers among the trees only grew louder. The storm that tore through Caldwell in late summer did more than peel shingles from roofs and flood the dirt roads. It ripped open the land itself, uncovering something that should have remained hidden. In the morning light, townsfolk picking through the wreckage near the edge of the Bleakmore property found bones scattered across the mud, tangled in tree roots that had been yanked upward by the wind. At first they thought they belonged to animals, deer perhaps, or livestock carried off by coyotes. But the closer they looked, the less certain they became. The bones were too small, too fragile, and too many. The discovery sent whispers through the town, whispers that quickly grew into fear. For days afterward, the smell lingered. It came on the wind in bursts, thick, sour, metallic, a scent that turned stomachs and made even the most skeptical men cross themselves. Some swore it was only rotting fruit, overripe apples crushed by the storm and left to fester, but others claimed it was sharper, like rust or dried blood. And the worst of them said, in hushed tones at the tavern, that the smell was not new, at all. It had always been there, faint and ignored, until the storm gave it the strength to be noticed. Caldwell was small, and small towns survive on routine. Farmers rose before dawn, mothers tended to children, men gathered tools and wagons to keep the harvest alive. But something shifted after the storm. People worked quicker, glancing often at the horizon where the orchard's dark mass of trees brooded. Fewer dared to walk that way alone. The tavern that had once buzzed with laughter now fell silent when anyone mentioned the Bleakmores. They were a quiet family, yes, but not strangers. Folks bought their apples at market, admired their neat rows of trees. Still, no one could deny that odd things clung to that farm. Strange noises at night, lights flickering among the branches, and the family itself, pale and watchful, as though keeping secrets too heavy for ordinary mouths to speak. Then came the stranger. He arrived on a mild September evening, stepping down from a creaking carriage in a black coat far too heavy for the season. His hair was the color of ash, and his skin seemed stretched too tight over his angular bones. He introduced himself as Dr. Silas Maro, a physician traveling west in search of unique cases. His words were polite, his manner calm, Yet his eyes, sharp, restless, hungry, unnerved those who met him. When he heard whispers of the bones unearthed by the storm, his attention sharpened as if a fire had been lit behind his gaze. At the sea tavern, he asked questions. Too many questions. What size were the bones? Were they splintered, cracked, chewed? Had anyone examined the soil? Did the storm reveal only one set, or many? His notebook filled with scrawled notes, strange symbols and crude sketches of skeletal fragments. Each answer made him lean forward eagerly, as though a puzzle were being solved piece by piece. When someone muttered that the orchard might be cursed, Maro's lips curled into the faintest smile. Cursed? He echoed softly. Or cultivated. That night, when others sought comfort in warm beds and closed shutters, Maro lit a lantern and walked alone down the dirt road that led to the Bleakmore farm. The orchard loomed ahead like a wall of shadows, the trees packed close together, their branches clawing at the sky. The moon cast silver light across the leaves, but within the rows it was dark, unnaturally dark. Yet the doctor pressed forward, unafraid. The orchard was not silent. The branches knocked against one another in the breeze, but the sound was not quite natural. It was rhythmic, almost purposeful, like 1,000 brittle fingers tapping in unison. Maro paused, listening. Then, beneath that noise, he heard another, a whispering, faint but steady, like children's voices overlapping in some secret chant. His pulse quickened. He opened his notebook and scribbled, "The soil speaks. Roots carry memory." Crouching low, he lifted the lantern to the base of a tree. The ground was slick, glistening. At first he thought it was rainwater trapped in the soil, but as he touched it, his fingers came away stained with something thick and dark. He raised it to his nose, inhaled, then tasted it. Blood. Not animal blood. Human. His lips curved into a smile that was part fascination, part triumph. Magnificent, he whispered to himself. A floorboard creaked. Maro turned. At the edge of the orchard, framed in lantern light spilling from the farmhouse porch, stood Jonas Bleakmore. He was tall, shoulders squared, with the lean build of a man who had worked the land all his life. His face was gaunt, his pale eyes cold, fixed on the intruder. For a moment, the two men simply stared at one another, the orchard, humming low around them like some slumbering beast disturbed. "You're trespassing," Jonas said at last. His voice carried easily, though it was no louder than a murmur. Maro straightened, lantern raised. "Your orchard is extraordinary," he replied, his tone filled with admiration. "The soil is richer than any I've studied. Blood feeds, roots better than water, but I've never seen it so perfected. You've discovered something here, something worth preserving." Jonas's expression did not change. He took one step forward, his boots crunching in the dark soil. The orchard's whispers grew louder, as if stirred by his presence. Behind him, the farmhouse door opened, and Miriam Bleakmore appeared. Her thin frame was wrapped in a shawl, her face pale and drawn. The faint glow from within revealed the shadows of children peering from behind her, their faces half hidden, eyes wide and unblinking. Miriam's voice shook as she spoke. "Leave," she said, her tone desperate. "Leave before it notices you." Maro tilted his head, intrigued. "It?" he asked softly, savoring the word. "What is it?" The orchard seemed to lean closer. Around him, the branches bowing as though listening. The whispers sank into a deeper register, no longer childlike but low and guttural, 1,000 murmurs blending into a single hum that vibrated through the soil. Maro felt it in his bones, a resonance that thrilled rather than frightened him. Jonas's gaze hardened. "You should go back to town, doctor," he said. His voice was firm, but beneath it trembled something Maro could not quite name. Fear, or perhaps resignation, but Maro only smiled wider. "No," he whispered. "I think I'll stay." The lantern flame flickered violently, casting monstrous shadows across the orchard. In that moment, Maro swore he saw movement, not in the wind, not in the sway of branches, but something writhing beneath the soil. Shapes pressed upward against the earth, as though dozens of hands clawed from below, straining toward the surface. The roots of the trees quivered, slick with the same dark fluid he had tasted, and in the air, carried on the hum, came words, not clear, not human, but words nonetheless. Hungry. Maro's heart raced. His pen scratched furiously across the page, capturing every detail. Yes, he murmured. Yes, I see now. The orchard isn't fed. It feeds. It consumes and remembers. This is not a curse. It is a design. Miriam stepped back into the house, pulling the children away from the doorway. Jonas remained on the porch, watching, his pale eyes unblinking. "You've been warned," he said quietly, but Maro only laughed, low and delighted, as the orchard's whispers swelled into a chorus. For him, this was no nightmare. It was discovery. The following morning, the town of Caldwell stirred restlessly. Rumors of Dr. Maro's late-night visit to the Bleakmore orchard spread quickly, carried in low voices across the bakery, the smithy, and the tavern. Some said he'd been turned away by Jonas Bleakmore at gunpoint. Others swore they had seen him standing in the orchard with his lantern held high, talking to no one, talking to the trees themselves. Maro, however, returned to town smiling. His notebook was clutched tightly under his arm, his boots caked in the black soil of the Bleakmore farm. When the townsfolk pressed him for answers, he only said, "What I have found here could change everything." He spoke as though he carried a great blessing, but his words unsettled more than they comforted. By the afternoon, many whispered that perhaps the stranger was worse than the Bleakmores themselves. That evening, Maro visited the sheriff, an old man named Harlan Briggs who had weathered 3 decades of dust, cattle raids, and the kind of violence that usually breaks weaker men. Briggs was not a man who frightened easily, but even he confessed to unease about the Bleakmore orchard. "You keep your distance, doctor," he warned. "That family ain't right. Things been wrong. There long before the storm, cows straying too close vanish. Children near the orchard walls claim to hear lullabies at night, and every harvest, their apples come sweeter, redder, juicier than any other tree in Kansas. But it's not right. It ain't natural." Maro leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "But don't you see? That's the point. Nature has been improved here, altered. The Bleakmores have unlocked a secret, one I intend to understand." Sheriff Briggs studied him carefully, then sighed. "Curiosity kills quicker than bullets, doctor. Don't say you weren't warned." That night, curiosity won. Lantern in hand, Maro returned to the orchard. The moon was high and sharp, cutting silver light across the fields. He walked between the rows of trees, his boots sinking into soft earth. The silence pressed in, broken only by the faint sound of something dripping. He followed it, weaving deeper into the orchard until he reached a clearing. There, at the base of one tree, he found what looked at first like a bundle of rags. But as he crouched closer, the truth revealed itself. It was a child's dress, faded blue, stiff with dried stains. Nearby lay a tiny shoe, the leather torn, the buckle rusted. Maro's breath quickened. He scribbled furiously in his notebook. Evidence of sacrifice. The orchard does not merely consume, it demands. The ground beneath the tree shifted. Slowly, with a wet sound, the soil cracked open. Something pale pushed upward. A fragment of bone, a small skull, dirt clinging to its hollow sockets. The lantern flame wavered as the roots curled around it, almost tenderly, pulling it back beneath the earth. Maro staggered back, his chest heaving. But even as horror prickled his skin, fascination burned brighter. "Magnificent," he whispered. Again, voice trembling. "It feeds and hides its own remains. The orchard is alive." A voice cut through the darkness. "You shouldn't be here." He spun around. Miriam Bleakmore stood at the edge of the clearing, shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. In the lantern's glow, her face looked hollow, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. Yet there was no anger in her expression, only sorrow. "You don't understand what you're waking," she said softly. Maro stepped closer, his notebook clutched to his chest. "On the contrary, madam, I understand perfectly. This—" He gestured toward the soil, the tree, the faint trace of bone. "Is a miracle, a natural engine of life and death. But why? Why children? Why sacrifice it all? Miriam's lips trembled. She shook her head. Not sacrifice, she whispered. Debt. The orchard stirred. The branches shivered, though no wind blew. Miriam's eyes darted upward, scanning the canopy as if fearful it might hear her. She moved closer, her voice urgent. We made a bargain, long before you came, long before this town. The land here was barren, cursed with drought and plague. Our family, we were starving. And then it offered us a way. It promised abundance if we gave it what it asked. Apples that never spoiled, harvests that never failed, survival. All it asked was the youngest, always the youngest. Her words fell heavy in the air. Maro felt his throat tighten, not with pity, but with wonder. So you feed it children, he said, awe dripping from every syllable. Miriam flinched. We feed it what it demands, or else it takes more. Whole families, whole towns. She stepped closer, her voice breaking. Please, doctor, leave. Go back to wherever you came from. If you stay, you'll only make it hungrier. But Maro's mind was already spinning, whirring like the gears of a clock. He saw not tragedy, but possibility. If such a bargain could be struck, then perhaps it could be controlled, replicated. He imagined orchards like this stretching across the nation, feeding millions, powered by hidden offerings beneath the soil. You don't see it, he whispered, almost to himself. This is not damnation. It is salvation. Miriam's eyes widened, horror dawning. She turned to leave, but before she could retreat into the shadows, the orchard itself seemed to rise. Branches twisted, leaves shuddered, and a sound rose from beneath the ground. Low, guttural, vibrating through the roots and up into the air. Hungry. The word rippled through the trees like wind, though the air was still. Maro staggered back, his lantern shaking. Miriam clutched her shawl tight, her face pale as bone. You've woken it, she whispered. The soil at Maro's feet split open. Roots surged upward, slick and pulsing, curling around his boots. He gasped, stumbling, but they released him just as quickly, slithering back into the ground. It was not an attack. It was a taste, a warning. Miriam's voice was barely a breath. It knows you now, and it will never let you leave. Maro's lantern sputtered and died, plunging the orchard into darkness. Yet even in the blackness he smiled. For in his heart, the fear was drowned by something stronger, ambition. The days that followed Dr. Maro's midnight discovery bled into one another like a fever dream. The orchard's presence, once confined to the edge of town, seemed to reach its roots farther each day. Livestock that wandered too close were found bloodless, their bodies tangled in vines as though embraced by a lover. Children complained of whispers outside their windows, lullabies carried on a wind that never seemed to touch the adults' ears. The town of Caldwell grew restless. Families who once bought Bleakmore apples by the bushel now crossed the street to avoid the family wagon. The fruit itself had begun to change. Larger, glossier, unnaturally red. Its skins veined faintly with what looked like threads of blood. Some swore they pulsed faintly when held in the hand, as though still alive. And yet, hunger overpowered disgust. Crops had failed across Kansas that year. Drought and locusts left the fields bare. For many, the Bleakmore harvest was the only food left to buy, and so people continued to eat, whispering prayers under their breath before biting into the shining flesh of the apples. Dr. Maro watched all of this with growing fascination. Each morning, he scribbled into his notebook, recording changes in the fruit, alterations in the soil, the strange music of the orchard that seemed to rise at nightfall. He did not fear the whispers as the townsfolk did. He listened, hoping to decipher their words. But others were not so curious. One night, a boy named Jacob Thorne vanished from his bed. His parents woke to find the window wide open, curtains fluttering, the sheets cold. A trail of small footprints led into the darkness of the fields, ending at the boundary of the Bleakmore orchard. The sheriff organized a search, lanterns swaying. Through the night, dogs barking and straining at their leashes. But the orchard swallowed sound. It swallowed light. No trace of Jacob was ever found. The townsfolk grew furious. They gathered outside the Bleakmore farmhouse, torches raised, voices hot with grief and rage. Jonas Bleakmore stood on the porch, with his shotgun, Miriam at his side, her face pale, lips trembling but silent. Jonas's voice thundered across the crowd. Not a step closer. This land is ours. Been ours since before you were born. You think to take it from us? You'll find yourselves buried in it before the night is out. His words struck like iron, and though the mob snarled and shouted, not a soul dared advance. Fear outweighed fury. Slowly, the townsfolk scattered, their torches dimming one by one, until only silence remained. But in the shadows of the orchard, Dr. Maro lingered. He had not joined the mob. He had been watching, learning. And when the Bleakmores retreated, inside he dared to cross the orchard's boundary once more. This time he carried tools, scalpel, vials, and a specimen jar. He had made up his mind. He would bring back proof of the orchard's hunger. Something that could be studied, replicated, perhaps even controlled. The deeper he walked, the more the orchard seemed alive. Branches bent toward him, leaves rustled, though no breeze stirred. The ground beneath his boots throbbed faintly, like the beat of a giant heart buried beneath the soil. He reached one of the central trees, its trunk grotesquely swollen, its bark stretched as though something inside pressed against it, yearning to break free. With shaking hands, he pressed his scalpel against the bark and cut. The tree bled. Thick, dark liquid seeped from the wound, smelling of iron and rot. Maro gasped, collecting it quickly into his vial, his eyes wide with awe. The bark quivered beneath his touch as though in pain, but he pressed harder, eager for more. Then he heard it. A cry. High-pitched, fragile, unmistakable. The cry of an infant. It echoed faintly from the hollow of the tree, muffled as though coming from deep inside its trunk. Maro froze, his scalpel slipping from his hand. His breath came fast, his rational mind screamed impossibility. Yet his ears did not lie. The tree wailed again, a child's scream that turned quickly into a gurgling laugh. The sound rose and fell, weaving with the rustle of the leaves until it became almost melodic, almost a lullaby. Maro staggered back, lantern trembling in his grip. Yet even as fear rattled his bones, he scribbled frantically in his notebook. Specimen confirms symbiosis with human tissue. Vocal capacity present. Suggests absorption of victim's essence. Orchard retains memory. Voices of the lost preserved. Suddenly a hand clamped onto his shoulder. He spun, nearly dropping. His lantern. It was Miriam. Her face was streaked with tears, her hands trembling. She shook her head fiercely. "You'll damn us all," she hissed. Maro opened his mouth, but she gripped his coat tighter, pulling him close, her voice sharp with desperation. "Don't you see? It doesn't just take the children. It keeps them. Their voices, their cries, their very souls. That's why the fruit is so sweet. That's why it never spoils. Every bite is their memory, their life." Her words sent a chill through him. For the first time, Maro faltered. He looked at the tree, at the dark liquid dripping from its wound, at the faint impression of a small hand pressed into the bark as though from the inside. But fascination still outweighed horror. "Then it is eternal," he whispered, almost reverently. "It transcends death. A child gone, yet never lost. Their essence feeds the living. Don't you see, Mrs. Bleakmore? This is not a curse. It is the key to immortality." Miriam recoiled, her face twisting with despair. "You're mad. Just like Jonas. Just like all of us who stayed too long on this land. Leave, before it claims you too." But Maro did not leave. He spent every night in the orchard, listening, recording, collecting samples. He began to hear the voices more clearly, not just cries, but whispers, phrases, songs. Sometimes they called his name. Sometimes they begged. And sometimes they promised. Meanwhile, the town's fear deepened. More children disappeared, one from his bed, another from the riverbank, the third vanishing as she fetched water at dusk. Always the same end. Small footprints leading toward the Bleakmore orchard, then nothing. Sheriff Briggs could no longer hold the town back. One night, driven by grief and starvation, the townsfolk gathered again, this time with not just torches but rifles and axes. "We'll burn it," Briggs declared, his voice hoarse. "Burn it to the ground and salt the earth." They moved as a mob, storming the orchard's boundary, but the moment they crossed into the rows of trees, the land shifted. Roots erupted from the soil, wrapping around ankles, pulling men screaming into the earth. Branches bent low, snatching torches and snapping them like twigs. The orchard howled, dozens, hundreds of voices rising together in a chorus of agony and laughter. Dr. Maro stood at the edge, notebook in hand, watching in awe. "Yes," he whispered, eyes shining. "Defend yourself. Show them what you are." By dawn, the mob was gone. The orchard stood untouched, its fruit hanging bright and heavy. Only a few scattered rifles and blood-stained hats remained in the soil. The survivors, those who fled before the roots caught them, never spoke of what they saw. But the town was broken. Caldwell became a place of silence, its streets empty, its windows shuttered, and always, on the horizon, the orchard stood, lush and full, its branches heavy with fruit. Dr. Maro, meanwhile, had made his choice. He was no longer an observer. He was a disciple, and soon he would become something far worse. Dr. Maro no longer kept his distance from the Bleakmore family. After the massacre of the townsfolk, he moved into their farmhouse like an uninvited guest who could not be removed. Jonas Bleakmore tolerated him, though not kindly, perhaps sensing that Maro had become as bound to the orchard as the family themselves. Miriam, however, looked at him with a mixture of pity and dread, as though she saw a reflection of what her own family had already become. By now, Maro's notebooks were overflowing. Each page was filled with sketches of twisted roots, diagrams of fruit dissected to reveal seed pods shaped disturbingly like small bones, and transcripts of the orchard's whispers. He called them choral phenomena. To him, they were not the cries of lost children, but the beginnings of a new kind of consciousness, something born from both flesh and soil. Late at night, while the Bleakmores slept, Maro carried out his experiments in the barn. He had converted the place into a crude laboratory. Glass jars lined the shelves, each containing fragments of bark or preserved pieces of fruit floating in dark liquid. On one table lay the bones of animals that had wandered too close to the orchard. Cows, dogs, even a fox, all of them picked clean, their marrow sucked dry. On another table, he kept his most prized possession, the vial of blood-like sap he had collected from the tree that cried like an infant. His experiments began small. He dripped the sap onto cuts in his own skin, fascinated by how quickly the wounds closed, how the flesh seemed to knit together before his very eyes. Then he began mixing the sap with the blood of livestock, injecting it into chickens and pigs. Within days, their bodies twisted, bones bending wrong, feathers darkening, eyes growing too large. Most of them died in agony. A few lived on, but they were wrong. Their movements jerky, their sounds shrill, as if the orchard itself had taken root inside them. But Maro's hunger for knowledge was insatiable. Animals were not enough. It was Miriam who caught him first. She had woken to a faint, muffled crying coming from the barn. For a moment she thought it was the orchard again, but when she followed the sound, she found Maro bent over a small figure strapped to the table. It was one of the missing children. No one knew how he had found her or lured her away. Her tiny arms were tied down, her mouth stuffed with cloth to silence her. Maro was drawing blood from her veins into a glass vial, his eyes wild with excitement. Miriam screamed. The child thrashed weakly. Maro looked up, his face pale in the lantern light, his voice trembling not with guilt, but with ecstasy. "Don't you see, Mrs. Bleakmore? The orchard doesn't just consume, it transforms. With the right balance, blood and sap together, we could free them from death. We could create something eternal, something greater than humanity itself." Miriam lunged at him, clawing the vial from his hand. It shattered on the floor, the dark liquid hissing as it touched the earth. Maro struck her across the face, his hand shaking, his breath ragged. "Do not interfere," he spat. "You are slaves to this land, clinging to fear and sorrow, but I will master it." Jonas stormed in moments later, shotgun in hand. The sight of Maro standing over the bound child nearly drove him to pull the trigger, but Miriam clutched his arm, whispering through bloodied lips, "Not yet. If you kill him now, the orchard will take us too." Reluctantly, Jonas lowered the gun. But from that night forward, both he and Miriam knew the orchard was no longer the greatest danger. Dr. Maro was. Wordlessly, the Bleakmores released the child and sent her fleeing into the night. They did not ask her name. They did not ask her story. She ran barefoot into the darkness, sobbing, vanishing into the prairie beyond. Perhaps she survived. Perhaps the orchard claimed her still. But her escape was the first act of defiance the Bleakmores had dared in years. Maro, furious, withdrew deeper into the orchard. He spent his nights sleeping at the roots of the central tree, as though it whispered secrets to him in dreams. His skin grew pale, his eyes hollow, and yet his body seemed stronger, as if the orchard itself was feeding him. The Bleakmores watched in horror as his humanity eroded. It was Miriam who finally spoke the truth aloud. One evening, as the family sat in silence, she whispered, "The orchard has chosen him, not us, him. It wants to spread." Jonas said nothing. But in his silence, Miriam heard agreement, and so the Bleakmores began to plan. The orchard was their curse, their burden, but if Dr. Maro was allowed to continue, he would become something worse than the orchard itself. He would become its prophet, its weapon, its voice. And in the gathering dark, as the orchard's branches swayed and whispered, it seemed to laugh at them all. The night it all came to an end began like any other in that cursed farm. The air was heavy with the orchard's sour, sweet scent, thick enough to choke on. The moon was full, bathing the twisted trees in silver light. From a distance, the orchard looked almost beautiful, rows of fruit-laden branches swaying gently in the breeze. But up close, the illusion broke. The fruit glistened wet in the moonlight, dripping not with dew, but with something darker, heavier. Blood. Jonas Bleakmore sat at the kitchen table, his shotgun across his lap. He had not spoken in hours. Miriam stood by the window, staring out at the orchard as though she could hear every whisper rising from its roots. Their children huddled silently by the hearth, eyes wide with a fear that had long since become part of their daily lives. They all knew tonight would be different. Dr. Maro had not returned from the orchard in 2 days. He had taken to vanishing. For long stretches, his body and mind more consumed by the orchard each time. When he finally emerged at dusk, the family barely recognized him. His clothes were torn, stained with sap and blood. His hands shook with a restless energy, and his eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the lantern light like an animal's. Around his neck hung a string of small bones. Fingers, perhaps, or the remains of some unlucky animal. His voice, when he spoke, was not entirely his own. "It is ready," he said, stepping into the farmhouse. His lips curled in a smile that revealed teeth sharpened unnaturally. "The orchard is ripe. It has chosen me to carry its seed." Miriam's breath caught in her throat. She whispered, "You're not a man anymore." Maro laughed. It was not his laugh, but the orchard's, 1,000 voices woven together, mocking. "I am more than a man. I am the bridge. With me, this land will bloom with life everlasting. With me, the orchard will spread until it consumes the world." Jonas stood, raising his shotgun. The children whimpered, clinging to Miriam's skirt. For a moment, no one breathed. "Step away from my home," Jonas growled, "or I'll put you in the ground." Maro only smiled wider. "Jonas," he whispered, "you still think you own this home? You don't. You never did. This land, this orchard, this curse, it owns you. It always has." And then, as if to prove his words, the orchard stirred. The earth outside groaned, roots breaking the surface like skeletal hands clawing their way free. Branches scratched against the windows, the glass rattling under their weight. The whispers rose, deafening now, filling the farmhouse with the sound of hundreds of crying infants. The Bleakmores knew they had no more time. Jonas pulled the trigger. The blast ripped through the air, striking Maro square in the chest. The doctor staggered backward, sap-like blood spraying from the wound. For a moment, it seemed he might fall. But then, impossibly, he straightened. The hole in his chest bubbled and sealed, threads of root weaving together where flesh had been destroyed. "You can't kill me," Maro hissed. "The orchard won't allow it." The trees outside shuddered violently, as though laughing. Fruit split open on their branches, spilling pale pulp and tiny bones onto the ground below. The earth reeked of rot and iron. Miriam grabbed her children, dragging them toward the cellar door. "Jonas," she cried, "we can't fight him. We have to burn it. Burn it all." Jonas hesitated only a moment before nodding. He grabbed a lantern from the wall, smashing it to the floor. Flames licked across the wooden boards, smoke curling toward the ceiling. But the orchard fought back. Roots burst through the walls, smothering the flames before they could spread. The house itself groaned, wood splintering as if the orchard meant to drag it down into the earth. Maro advanced, his steps unnaturally steady, his eyes locked on Jonas. "You can't escape. You can't destroy it. You are part of it. Your family, your blood, your bones. They all feed the orchard. You always have." Jonas roared in defiance, swinging the butt of his shotgun into Maro's face. Bone cracked, sap sprayed, but still the man-thing stood. The orchard screamed louder, branches slamming against the walls, shattering glass, reaching for the children who cried in terror. It was Miriam who acted then, not with strength, but with desperation. She snatched the vial from Maro's neck, the one filled with his most precious sample of sap. With all her strength, she hurled it into the fireplace. The explosion was small, but its effect was not. The flames turned green, roaring higher than the chimney should have allowed. The orchard shrieked, a sound so piercing the family clutched their ears in pain. Maro staggered, clutching his chest as the firelight reflected in his hollow eyes. "No," he howled. "You don't understand. It's eternal. It cannot die." But Miriam was already shoving her children toward the door, screaming at Jonas to follow. Together, they ran into the orchard itself, flames spilling from the farmhouse. Behind them, the orchard writhed in fury. Roots snatched at their feet, branches whipped at their faces, fruit burst open to release clouds of choking spores. Yet still they ran, Jonas carrying the last lantern in his hand. When they reached the central tree, the largest, the one that cried like a child, they stopped. The tree towered above them, its bark slick with sap, its hollow trunk breathing like a living lung. From its branches hung shapes that looked disturbingly human, as though the orchard had been growing bodies instead of fruit. "This is it," Miriam gasped. "This is the heart." Jonas didn't hesitate. He hurled the lantern at the roots. Fire bloomed instantly, racing up the trunk. The tree screamed, a sound so human it froze their blood. The branches convulsed, flinging burning fruit in every direction, and from the shadows came Maro, his body blackened by flame but still moving, still alive. He staggered toward the tree, arms outstretched, pleading like a child for its mother. "Take me back," he begged. "Don't let them destroy you. I am yours. I am your son." The tree responded, its roots curled around him, dragging him against its trunk. His body fused with the bark, his screams echoing with both terror and joy. Slowly, horribly, he was pulled inside. The Bleakmores watched as the fire consumed them both. The orchard writhed, its whispers turning into shrieks, until at last the flames drowned them out. One by one, the trees collapsed, their trunks splitting open, spilling bones and blackened fruit into the soil. By dawn, nothing remained but ash. The Bleakmores stood on the smoking ground, their faces streaked with soot and tears. The farmhouse was gone, the orchard destroyed. But the land felt no freer. The soil still reeked of blood, and in the distance, the prairie grass swayed gently, as though something beneath the earth was still breathing. Miriam held her children close, whispering a prayer that felt empty. Jonas stared at the horizon, his eyes hollow. The orchard was gone, but its hunger, they knew, was not.